I also really like how this makeup turned out. For some shit that I had absolutely no plan for. Could have been worse. What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, hi! My name is Jessica and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds appealing to you, then I suggest maybe subscribing to the channel because then I'll just appear in your feed every Monday and doesn't that sound fun? If not, that's perfectly fine. We all have preferences and I'm certainly not going to be everyone's. And if you happen to be one of those people, then all you have to do is tap dance on down to the description box where I've graciously listed some other creators that have covered today's story in a way that is probably more suited to what you'll enjoy. Listen, I'm just out here trying to make everyone as happy as I can. And with that, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Okay, so as you likely gathered by the content warnings you just saw, today's case is quite a doozy. I mean, I will try to keep it as palatable as I can, but we're also going to be talking about a guy who killed people and ate their genitalia, so no matter how you slice it, it's gonna be a rough ride, okay? Today we're going to be talking about a man who, throughout the span of his horrific crimes, earned himself such titles as the Red Ripper, the Butcher of Rostov, the Forest Strip Killer, and the Rostov Ripper. However, before he was definitively linked to his crimes, he was simply and innocently known to his friends and family as Andre. Alright, so Mr. Andre Chikatilo was born on October 16th, 1963, in the village of Yabluchne, which is located in the Solmshinya province of the Ukrainian SSR. He was said to be the second child born to his parents Roman and Anna Chikatilo, having maybe been preceded by an older brother, but put a pin in that because we'll get into that in a minute. Now, prior to the 1930s, the Ukraine was actually commonly referred to as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, because it produced an abundance of food. However, due to Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, which began in 1928, Andre actually grew up poor and starving. And this was because basically what this collectivization did was it combined individual peasant farms into state-controlled joint enterprises. And Stalin believed that by doing this, the USSR would almost immediately see an increase in the supply of food, raw materials, and other miscellaneous agricultural exports. And in theory, this all sounds great, but the individual farmers were actually really not into this idea. They didn't want to combine their farms. They didn't want to turn over their crops to the government and risk not getting an adequate amount of food back. They just didn't have a lot of faith in the government as far as this particular practice was concerned. Can't imagine why. However, and I don't know if you know much about Stalin, but he wasn't the most understanding guy. So when he got word that some of the farmers were trying to refuse this whole collectivization process, in response, he ordered that the land be forcibly taken, and that if any of the farmers dared to raise a stink about all of this, they were to be either beaten, threatened, or even deported. Basically, Stalin told his goons to go out and get the land under any means necessary. And they did. Throughout this time frame, upwards of 300,000 peasant farmers were deported to the outskirts of the USSR, or they were condemned to work camps, all in an effort to more efficiently crank out food and resources to Stalin's empire. However, there was one teeny tiny little problem with all of this, and that was that it didn't work. On top of the fact that Stalin had deported droves of the most knowledgeable farmers, bad weather and pests also took a massive toll on the collective farms, and ultimately this led to significantly lower crop yields than had been seen in the past from the individual farms. This led to widespread famine all across the USSR and eventually led to the death of millions of people. And while the epidemic did gravely affect the entire Soviet Union, it hit the Ukraine particularly hard. And this shit went on for like 12 years. It went from 1928 to 1940, I think. So being born smack dab in the middle of all of this in 1936, Andre grew up poor. Like, poor. It's actually said that his family was often forced to eat grass and leaves as a means to survive. And Andre himself once said that he never even tasted bread until he was like 12 years old. Not surprisingly, given all that I've told you thus far, Andre always recalled his childhood being just sullied by tragedy. In addition to the extreme poverty and famine, Andre's mother also often told him horrific stories of what had supposedly happened to her first son. According to Anna, before Andre was born, she and Roman had another son, a boy named Stefan, who obviously would have been Andre's older brother. However, Anna told Andre that when Stefan was just 4 years old, which was during a particularly chaotic period of the Ukrainian famine, Stephen had been kidnapped by the Chikatilos' starving neighbors and eaten. And if upon hearing that, you're like, what? That is fucked up. You wouldn't be wrong, but I do think it's important to note that there is no record that can definitively prove or disprove whether or not this happened. And honestly, there's really no proof as to if Stefan ever actually existed. So now that you have all of the information, take that story however you want. Real, fake, there's no way to tell. But what I think we can all safely assume is that this story fucked Andre all the way up. I mean, there is no way that hearing this did not have a deeply negative psychological impact on him. And guess what? It is only going to get worse. After the Soviet Union joined World War II, Andre's father Roman was drafted into the Red Army and forced into battle. He ended up being wounded in combat, which actually led to him being taken by German soldiers and held in a prison camp for like 4 or 5 years. And at this time, the Chikatilos were living in a one-room hut, which, due to the obvious lack of space, Andre was forced to share a bed with his mother for years. And before anyone gets offended, I want to make it clear that I have nothing against co-sleeping. If you're doing it safely and it's what works for your family. I mean, I'd rather sleep naked on broken glass, but do what's best for you. Doesn't affect me either way. The problem that did arise from this, though, was that Andre was a chronic bedwetter, and this is believed to have been the result of Andre having suffered from hydrocephalus, which is a buildup of fluid in the brain most commonly found in infants and elderly patients. And because Andre was born with this condition, it's believed that he suffered some level of brain damage that ultimately caused genital and urinary tract dysfunction. And these issues are thought to explain not only his chronic bedwetting, which lasted late into his adolescence, by the way, but it's also believed to be the reason that later in life, Andre was incapable of sustaining an erection. So it's just like a shitty deal all around for him. And don't worry, I'm not glossing over it. We'll get more into the whole erection thing later. I'm sure you were sweating. But as far as the bedwetting, like I said, this made sharing a bed with his mother particularly traumatic because, well, one, I'm sure it was humiliating enough on its own, but compounded with the fact that Anna would mercilessly berate and even beat Andre every single time it happened, which I cannot even imagine how traumatic that must have been. And at this point, I bet you're thinking, like, wow, it could not possibly get much worse for this kid. And to that I say, sure the heck can, and it most certainly does. Because with Roman away at war / imprisoned by the Germans, this left Anna and Andre alone to fend for themselves during the German invasion. And it's believed that Andre's little sister, Tatiana, who was conceived and born while Roman was imprisoned, well, it's widely thought that she was likely the result of Anna being raped by a German soldier. Evidently, Ukrainian women being raped by German soldiers was fairly common. And since the German soldier theory is actually the only explanation or speculation that I've seen regarding Tatiana's paternity, and she very clearly wasn't Roman's, it, I guess leaves little to the imagination. And what's really disturbing about this, I mean, aside from all of it, is that given the size of the Chikatilo's hut and, the one-roomedness of it, if the German soldier theory is really what happened, then it's more likely than not that 6-year-old Andre was actually front and center to witness this attack on his mother. I mean, it's certainly no excuse for the tomfoolery of his adult actions, but I do think it's okay for us to feel bad for what he went through as a child. It doesn't mean that you think his later crimes are justified. It just means that you're empathetic to what an, at the time, innocent child went through. Two things can be true at once. You can think what he does as an adult is disgusting while also feeling bad that he went through his own disgusting stuff as a child. And guess what? We're still not done. When the war ended, Andre was forced to publicly denounce his father as a coward for having allowed himself to be captured. And as if the public humiliation wasn't enough, Roman was actually temporarily placed in a Russian prison camp as punishment for being a traitor. And what's crazy is that even given everything that he went through, Roman was still reportedly an incredibly kind and gentle man. Tatiana, way down the line, spoke very highly and very lovingly of Roman, while alluding to the fact that Anna was more of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she kind of insinuated that Anna was, a bitch. I mean, I think we all already, kind of collectively came to that assumption when we heard that she routinely beat her son for having a medical condition. But in case you had any doubts, that is straight from Tatiana, who obviously had more of a first-hand experience with Anna than any of us, so take that for what you will. Andre started school in 1944, and surprise, surprise, just like everything else in his life leading up to it, it kind of sucked for him. Academically speaking, he was thriving. He was an excellent student, and his teachers loved him. His peers, however, Andre was shy and awkward and all around just kind of meek. And because of this, as well as the social mark that had been left on the Chikatilo family following Roman's capture, Andre was bullied constantly to the point where he barely even spoke to anyone when he was at school. Instead, he Instead, he forewent the social aspect of school and instead immersed himself in his studies. And by the time he was a teenager, he was basically a model student. He loved reading and studying. He was the editor of his school's newspaper. He was the chairman of the Student Communist Party, and he was even put in charge of organizing street marches for the group. So from the outside looking in, it could have seemed like Andre was doing at least fairly well, but on a personal level, Andre was really struggling. As he went through puberty, which, let's face it, is tough for everyone, but Andre struggled especially hard as he began to realize that he suffered from chronic impotence. So while his peers were probably struggling not to pitch a tent in class, Andre was struggling with the fact that he couldn't get one up at all. At least not for any significant amount of time. And not surprisingly, this completely and totally obliterated whatever minuscule fragment of self-esteem Andre may have had left. He became even more socially awkward, and over time, he really started to hate himself. He was just becoming an overall really angry and loathsome person. Now, despite his antisocial nature, Andre did have some crushes here and there throughout his youth, but he was way too shy and nervous to ever act on them. So instead of talking to these girls, he forced his feelings down and essentially repressed them. And because of this, Andre wouldn't have any experiences with the opposite sex until he was 17 years old, and even this experience was not a traditional teenage experience.
I want to experience things, but I don't think you actually want to experience things because you would experience it if you wanted to experience things.
You see, what happened was Tatiana, who was 11 at this time, brought a friend home to play. And while, if I'm being honest, the deets of this whole situation aren't super clear, my understanding is that the three of them were playing some sort of game, and Andre either fell on top of, or, I don't know, tackled the friend. I'm really not sure exactly what happened. Either way, I do know that somehow Andre ended up on top of this girl, which is inappropriate to begin with, but it's what happened next that, as this girl and him kind of, I guess, wrestled around, Andre, well, so that was embarrassing for him. However, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was also enlightening for him, because it was that moment in particular that taught Andre that he could achieve satisfaction in the presence of violence or a struggle, which, great combination. So fast forward a little bit, Andre graduates high school in 1954 with excellent grades and high hopes of attending Moscow State University. But in true Andre fashion, he did not score high enough on the entrance exam. Therefore, his application was rejected and his dreams were quashed. And rather than apply to any other universities, Andre instead moved to Kursk, where he worked a few odds and end type manual labor jobs before he enrolled in a 2-year vocational training program in 1955 with the goal of becoming a communications technician. He was able to complete this program, but right as he finished his training in 1957, he was drafted into the Soviet Army. Initially, he worked as a border guard in Central Asia before he was then moved to a position at a KGB communications unit in East Berlin. And as far as I can tell, his military career was fine. I wasn't able to find any reports of him having any issues throughout that time frame. His service record was basically perfect, and he was a great little soldier. So, snaps for Andre. So once he finished his obligatory yet glowing military service, Andre moved back home with his parents and he worked on the farm. However, this was short-lived because after a few failed relationships, word of Andre's problems spread like wildfire around the town, and he was so ashamed that he actually tried to hang himself. But before he'd gone past the point of no return, he was discovered by his mother, and with the help of some of their neighbors, she managed to get him down. So once he'd recovered from this attempt on his life, Andre decided it would be best if he just packed up and moved away, hoping to leave his shame behind and start anew, far, far, far away from his hometown and all of these people who knew his secret. Andre ended up taking a job as a communications technician in Rostov-on-Don, which during the Soviet era was the 10th largest city in the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. Say that 10 times fast. And actually, even today, Rostov-on-Don is still considered to be like a big bustling city. So Andre went from modest farm life to big city vibes. And then in 1961, when Tatiana finished her schooling, she also moved to Rostov-on-Don, where she stayed with Andre in his apartment for about 6 months. And during this 6 months, seeing how lonely and desolate her brother's life had become, Tatiana, being the ever-loving sister she was, she vowed that one way or another, someday, somehow, she would help her brother find a wife. And in 1963, she made good on that promise. She introduced her brother to a woman named Fedosia Odnacheva, and within 2 weeks, the two were married. But believe it or not, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because, well, nothing with this man is, but also because even though he was physically attracted to Feodosia, Andre still had the same problems we already discussed. So when it came time for he and her to expand their family, they had some trouble. They obviously weren't able to conceive by traditional means, so ultimately they had to get creative. So basically, Andre deposited his sample onto his own hand, and then he manually put it where it needed to be. And believe it or not, that actually worked. And in 1965, they had a daughter, and in 1969, they had a son. And with the birth of his children, meaning that he had multiple people now depending on him, Andre went back to school. He attended Rostov University, graduating in 1970 with a degree in Russian literature and philology, which he ultimately parlayed into a position as a Russian language and literature teacher. But despite being incredibly intelligent and having a comprehensive knowledge of subject he was teaching, Andre was kind of still the shy, awkward, timid kid he'd always been. So even though he was well into his adulthood at this point, he was still intimidated by these school kids, just as he'd been throughout his own schooling. And this resulted in Andre really struggling to control his class. No matter how hard he tried, they did not seem to respect him or to take him seriously. It even went so far that they would openly mock him throughout class, and some students even threatened to physically attack him. And while he took this abuse on the chin for a while, eventually Andre decided that he'd had enough, that he was going to turn the tables on these kids and start using his position of authority to his advantage. And just one last heads up, it's about to get absolutely disgusting and vile, so brace yourself. So it's May 1973. Andre's at school, his students are in the pool, and he decides that, now seems good. And on a dime, Andre flipped. He jumped in the pool, he swam up to a 15-year-old girl, cornered her, and then groped her all over her body until he, as the girl struggled to get away from him. Now, obviously, this is egregious, right? Undoubtedly, he was not only fired for this, but he was arrested, right?
Right to jail, right away.
Wrong. Andre saw no consequences for this, and he was allowed to keep teaching for a while. And he kept right on terrorizing his students the whole rest of the time. He locked a student in a classroom and essayed them at one point. He used to openly diddle himself in front of students. He had no qualms. He used to lurk around the girls' dormitory in hopes of seeing the female students getting undressed. I mean, he was a certified creep. He would look for any opportunity he could to insert himself into a situation if he thought he could ultimately parlay it into a way to satisfy his nasty little limp dick desires. Christ, the man used to carry around gum as a way to initiate contact with young girls. And I cannot stress this enough that this stuff was not a secret. The school definitely knew about a lot, if not all of it. So for the life of me, I cannot understand why it took so long for him to see any consequences. I mean, I have to assume that they were just trying to protect the school's public image, but come on. It should have only taken that one incident in the pool to lock him up, strip away his ability to teach and to be around children and to see the light of day ever again. Instead, it took dozens of different complaints from multiple students over months before the director of the school finally gave Andre the ultimatum of either voluntarily resigning from his position or forcibly being removed from it. Andre chose option one. He quietly resigned and went on to immediately find another teaching job. And he was at this school for about 4 years before he was laid off in September of 1978 due to staff cutbacks. And after he lost that job, he took the opportunity to move. He relocated to Shakti, where just 3 months later, Andre would commit his first known murder. It was December 22nd, 1978, when Andre lured 9-year-old Yelena Zakhanova into a nasty, rundown little, shed type structure that he'd purchased. He got her in it. He attempted to rape her, but he couldn't keep his boner long enough to do so he flew into a rage. And even though Yelena struggled desperately to try and get away, sadly, Andre was able to overpower her. He choked her, he stabbed her, and then as he saw the life begin to leave this poor little girl's eyes, that is when Andre reached his climax. And once he was sure that Yelena was dead, he callously dumped her body in a river where it would ultimately be discovered 2 days later. And despite the fact that an eyewitness had actually seen Andre at the bus stop with Yelena before she was killed, they were only able to give police a description of him. They didn't know exactly who he was. But instead of trying to identify this man that the witness saw, police instead zeroed in on a completely different man. A man named Alexander Kravchenko. Listen, I'm doing my absolute best, okay? I'm American, and these names are hard. Now, Alexander was no angel. That's for sure. He'd already served one prison term previously for the rape and murder of a teenage girl. So despite the fact that he had been at home with his wife and a friend of hers the entire afternoon that Yelena had been killed, and despite the fact that multiple neighbors of the couple were able to corroborate this alibi, police basically threatened Alexander's wife and friend into incriminating him. And once they were able to get the women to alter their testimonies, they confronted Alexander with this information, and eventually he broke down and confessed to Yelena's murder, even though he was completely innocent of this particular crime. Eventually, he did go on to attempt to retract his confession, but Alexander was ultimately executed via firing squad for Yelena's murder in 1983. So yeah, while you digest that, I'm gonna take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we come back, it gets worse. Don't go nowhere. Okay, so Andre's committed his first murder. He's managed to get away with it, and kind of by proxy, he's taken someone else's life as well, since Alexander was put to death for his crime. And meanwhile, Andre's just skating through life, not a care in the world. He got a job working as a traveling supply clerk for a Rostov-based factory, and this gave him free reign and ample time to search all over the Soviet Union for new victims. And on September 3rd, 1981, Andre struck again. After noticing a 17-year-old girl named Larissa standing alone at a bus stop, Andre lured her into some nearby woods, offering her some vodka. But as soon as they were secluded where no one could see them, Andre pounced. He jumped on Larissa, tore off her clothes, and he tried to assault her. But if there's anything that we know about Andre, it's that he's got the world's most uncooperative weenie. Therefore, he once again was unable to stay hard during the attack, and obviously Larissa's screaming, she's frantic, she's yelling out constantly, hoping that someone will hear her and come save her. However, her screams went unheard, and eventually Andre took leaves and mud and pushed them into her mouth to muffle her cries. He then, brace yourselves, he then bit off her nipple and ate it in front of her. She's still alive for all of this. So I cannot even begin to imagine how fucking horrific and disturbing and painful this must have been for her. It makes my stomach turn. And Andre then, because he was unarmed, he grabbed a nearby stick and he proceeded to stab Larissa in the stomach before striking her to death. He then covered her body with leaves and branches and newspaper and just left her there, where she was discovered the next day, mouth still filled with mud and leaves that Andre had used to silence her cries for help. This man is so sick, and he is, we're just not even close to done, you guys. And speaking of that, speaking of how much we still have to get through, it's going to start to move pretty quickly going forward, the story. And I want to stress that it is not out of any disrespect for the victims, who they were, or what they went through. Honestly, this is why I don't love covering serial killers, because in order to fit the information into a single video, it is really hard to give the victims the spotlight that they truly deserve. And to be frank, it's not only a time constraint, but it's also largely due to the fact that there just aren't Wikipedia pages and documentaries and news articles and books available that actually extensively cover the victims of cases like this. I'm truly not trying to be disrespectful, and I'm not trying to be dismissive. I'm simply working with the information that's available. So following Larissa's murder, Andre took about a 9-month cool-down period. He didn't strike again until June 1982, when inevitably his urge to kill became more than, I guess, he cared to manage. It was June 12th specifically that Andre was walking home from a trip into town when he noticed a 13-year-old girl. He followed her for about a quarter of a mile, just making casual, friendly small talk until he was sure that they were completely concealed by surrounding bushes and shrubs, at which point Andre then made his move. He ambushed her, forcing her kicking and screaming into the bushes, where he tore off her clothes before her over 20 times. He then dry humped her body until he satisfied himself, and then he removed her eyeballs because he was afraid of this old Russian superstition that said that the final image a murder victim saw, so an image of their murderer, I guess it was believed that that would imprint on the victim's eyes forever. And since Andre wasn't trying to get caught, he cut out her eyeballs so that no one would see his image imprinted in them. He then concealed her body and just headed back home. And sadly, this poor girl, she wouldn't be discovered for 2 weeks, during which time Andre basked in the fact that it had actually been remarkably easy for him to pick up a victim at the bus station. And I mean, it makes sense if you think about it, because people are usually walking to and from the bus station alone. They're either adults heading to work or children heading to and from school. It was a veritable smorgasbord of victims for Andre. All he had to do was find a way to make contact with them and entice them to follow him, and bam, he had them. He mostly targeted children. He'd either offer them candy or stamps or something else enticing to children to get them to follow him. And on the less frequent occasions that he targeted an adult, he would lure them to a secluded area under the promise of either alcohol or money. But no matter the age of Andre's chosen victim, the result was sadly always the same. He would try to either rape or initiate consensual intercourse with them, obviously dependent upon the age of the victim. But he could never perform, which would always send him into a homicidal rage, and he would then stab and slash his victims to death, which would then give him the release he had been looking for. And as his urges escalated, his methods also became more extreme, and it's a lot. In December 1982, Andre met a 10-year-old girl whom he lured into a cornfield at the edge of town, where he proceeded to attack her, grope her, and stab her over 50 times. And once he was satisfied, he removed her eyes, removed her bowels, removed her uterus, and then just left her there. And this poor girl wouldn't be discovered for 2 months, during which time the elements, as well as the surrounding wildlife, completely destroyed what was left of her remains. Now, believe it or not, there was an investigation into all this going on. Police were even fairly certain that all these murders had been committed by the same person. And because of this, a team of Rostov investigators had been tasked with solving these cases. Due to the sheer savagery of the killings and the post-mortem mutilation, police theorized that the murders were being committed by either a black market band of organ harvesters or a satanic cult, because obviously. Ooh, or of course there was the old tried and true scapegoat, someone suffering with a mental illness. The investigation was widely referred to among police as Operation Forest Path. And despite the task force, the super cool nickname, and, a general desire to stop the madness, investigators would not work fast enough to stop Andre from committing just, so many more murders. And like I said, it wasn't for lack of trying. In some instances, you might even say that they tried too hard. They got several men to confess to Andre's crimes, mostly younger men who struggled with cognitive difficulties, who only admitted to the crimes after long, drawn-out, and barbaric interrogations. And in some instances, 3, I think, Persons of interest actually took their own lives after being subjected to the brutal tactics that these investigators were employing. And almost as fast as police would obtain a confession, another body would be discovered, which obviously disproved the confession. Sounds like a real fucking mess, if I'm being honest. But even with that, they were able to do some good through all of this. As a result of the investigation, they were actually able to solve more than 1,000 unrelated crimes. They solved almost 100 murders, close to 150 physical assaults, and almost 250 rapes. So, I mean, they weren't catching Andre, but they certainly seemed to be catching damn near everyone else. And all the while this is going on, Andre's just out running amok all throughout these Soviet streets. He murdered a 15-year-old girl named Laura in June of 1983. He murdered a 19-year-old named Vera in October of 83. In December, he lured a 14-year-old off of a train and to a secluded area where he murdered and mutilated him. In early 1984, he murdered 2 women in a park. In March of 1984, he lured a 10-year-old away from a stamp kiosk and off to his subsequent doom. In May of 1984, he killed a woman and her 10-year-old daughter after isolating them in the woods. And by the end of June, he'd killed 3 more women and a 13-year-old boy. So he was for real just like wilding out. On August 2nd, Andre killed a 16-year-old in a park. On August 7th, he lured a 17-year-old to the banks of a river where he murdered and mutilated her. By mid-September, he killed 3 more people, a woman, a girl, and a boy. And is your head spinning yet? Because I need an Excedrin. Okay, so finally, September 13th, 1984, Andre finally makes his way onto police's radar when 2 undercover detectives noticed him trying to talk to multiple young women and girls at the bus station. They ended up following him from the bus station as he wandered through the city, and after seeing him rubbing up on multiple women, completely uninvited, they arrested him and took him into the station for questioning. When they searched him upon his arrival to the station, they discovered that he had in his possession a knife, some rope, and some Vaseline. He also appeared to match the physical description that had been given by a few witnesses that had seen him with some of the victims before they'd been killed. So Andre was definitely looking more than a little sus. But there was one way that they could be sure if the man sitting in front of them, Andre Chikatilo, was in fact the man they'd been looking for. The Rostov Ripper, the Butcher of Rostov, the Forest Strip Killer, whatever you want to call him. Police had been able to recover a DNA sample from 6 of the victims that had been killed throughout mid-1984. So all they had to do was compare Andre's DNA to the DNA from the murders and they would have their answer. So that's what they did. They took a sample of Andre's blood, they sent it off to have it compared to the DNA samples they'd recovered from the murder victims, and when the results came back, they didn't match. What? Bet you didn't see that one coming.
But Jessica, you spent this entire video telling us that he committed these murders. How is that possible?
That's a great question. I would love to tell you. So Andre's what's known as a non-secretor, which sounds disgusting, but in actuality, it just means that his blood type is different than his other fluids. I guess it is disgusting. So even though he absolutely was guilty, his blood type came back as type A, whereas the DNA samples recovered from the murders had come back as type AB. And because of this, the police basically wrote him off as being their guy. They took down his information in case they needed to speak with him again, but other than that, they basically just sent him on his way. But this brush with the law definitely did make an impact on Andre. He didn't kill again for almost a year following this little close call. Instead, he found a new job and he tried to keep a low profile, which he was able to do until August 1st, 1985, when his urges once again reared their ugly little head. He was on a business trip in Moscow when he came across an 18-year-old girl whom he lured into the woods, where he then bound, stabbed, and strangled her. And despite this murder having happened almost 700 miles away from Rostov, police did still connect it with the Operation Forest Path cases, but considering they still didn't know who was responsible for those cases, it really didn't get them any closer to figuring out this whole thing. And this left the door open for Andre to strike yet again. On August 27th, 1985, Andre murdered a woman named Irina. And at this point, police are like, what are we doing wrong? Like, why can we not catch this guy? And I cannot even begin to imagine how frustrating this must have been for them. I mean, they had to feel like they had been chasing their tail for just years at this point, which they had. So they decided it was time to just like completely overhaul the investigation. A new investigator was named to oversee the operation. 44 fresh sets of eyes were called in to work on the manhunt, and undercover female officers were sent to like lurk around train stations and bus stations in hopes of enticing their killer. And groundbreaking, for the first time in a serial killer investigation in the Soviet Union, police actually requested the help of a psychiatrist, Dr. Alexander Bukanovsky. And Dr. Bukanovsky, after looking over all of the crime scene reports and medical examiner's reports and basically all of the evidence that police had, he took it and used it to handcraft a 65-page psychological profile of who he believed was committing these murders. So based on the information that he was given, Dr. Bukanovsky deduced that their suspect was likely a reclusive man aged between 45 and 50 years old who had endured a painful and isolated childhood and who was incapable of flirting with or courting a woman. He was likely well-educated, married, and probably even had a few children. But he was also a sadist who suffered from impotence and could only achieve sexual arousal and release by seeing his victims suffer. What? I think that forensic psychology and criminal profiling is fascinating. The fact that this guy hit the nail so perfectly on the head just based off of his knowledge of like the inner workings of the human psyche is just wow. And this information was actually released to the public as well as other like little bits and bobs from the investigation, which Andre followed very closely. And because he was now starting to feel the heat, probably because Dr. Bukanovsky had all but put a picture of him in his criminal profile, Andre was very careful. For almost a year, police found no other victims that they could link to the Operation Forest Path. The next victim that bore the trademark mutilations of the Rostov Ripper wasn't found until August 18th, 1986. The victim was an 18-year-old. She had been cut open from her neck to her privates. She'd had one of her breasts removed, and her eyes had been cut out. In 1987, Andre killed 3 people. He killed a 12-year-old in May, a 12-year-old in July, and a 16-year-old in September. But because he had committed all of these murders while he was on business trips far, far away from Rostov, none of them were initially linked to the Rostov Ripper or to Operation Forest Path. And I don't think anything else was linked to this until '88. He killed 3 times that year too, a woman in April, 2 boys, one in May and one in June. And even when it came to the woman's murder, they weren't totally sure because Andre's MO had kind of gotten all over the place. But when it came to the boys' murders and their specific post-mortem mutilation, they knew for sure that the Rostov Ripper was no longer lying dormant. However, just as quickly as he seemed to return, he seemed to disappear again. Andre didn't kill again until February of 1989 when he killed a 16-year-old girl. And y'all, this man killed this girl in his daughter's apartment. I mean, I don't think that she was staying there at this particular point in time, but God, still, the audacity. And then, yes, I know that it feels never ending. Believe me, I know. But then, over the next 6 months, Andre struck 4 more times, even though initially only 2 of the victims were linked to the Rostov manhunt. So, fast forward to 1990, January 14th, Andre sees an 11-year-old standing outside of a local theater, and obviously he can't just let this poor child be. No. Instead, he lured him away from the theater, promising to show him a movie at his house or something. And then once he had the boy isolated and alone, he stabbed him, mutilated him, and eventually discarded his body in the woods. And then, 7 weeks later, he lured another 10-year-old boy away from a train station, only to do the exact same thing to him. I honestly don't even know if I could make an accurate guess as to the victim count we're at right now. I would have to go back through and actually tally everything up. I mean, this guy was like a vile, completely unhinged, murderous Energizer bunny. He just kept going and going and going and going and going. He ended up killing 6 more people throughout 1990 before finally, oh my God, finally, he finally got caught. It was November 6th, 1990, when Andre lured a 22-year-old into the woods near a train station. And once he thought they were alone, he overpowered her, murdered her, and mutilated her body before returning to the train station, where he rinsed off his hands and his face in a nearby well. And while, yes, this all sounds pretty par for the course for Andre, what he didn't know was that an undercover police officer, Igor Rybakov, had witnessed not only his whole cleanup routine, but he'd also noticed grass and soil stains on Andre's clothes, as well as a red smear on his cheek and what appeared to be a fresh, fairly deep cut on one of his fingers. Igor did stop and briefly question Andre about what he'd seen, but because he didn't have like an actual real concrete reason to arrest him, he simply had to take down his information and let him go. It wasn't until 7 weeks later when that woman's body was discovered, which, by the way, I have it in my notes here, she was the 38th victim that was linked to the Rostov manhunt. And when she was finally discovered, investigators pooled and reviewed all of the reports of all of the men that had been stopped and questioned over the course of that particular week. And guess whose name was scribbled all up and down them little reports? Yep. Andre motherfucking Chikatilo. And remember, police are already familiar with Andre, so the fact that he's found his way back into their crosshairs definitely seems like more than just a coincidence. So the very next day, police start surveillance on Andre, and almost immediately they catch him approaching young women and children and trying to engage them in conversation. And if the conversation fizzled out, he seemed to just move right along to the next person. And the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person. And after 6 days of surveillance, almost a week of watching this creepo prey on women and children, Andre was arrested by 4 undercover police officers. Obviously, he denied everything, again, even referencing back to his 1984 arrest, telling police, like, guys, didn't we do this already? I'm innocent. But again, Andre was found to have a knife and rope in his possession, and again, police took a blood sample from Andre to compare to the DNA that they'd recovered from some of their victims. And meanwhile, while waiting for those results, Andre was put in a cell with a police informant who was instructed to try and elicit as much information from him as he possibly could, but Andre was not talking. And police were definitely on a clock. The case that they had against Andre was mostly circumstantial, and according to Soviet law, they had just 10 days that they could hold him before they either had to charge him with something or they had to let him go. Again. So they must have been especially frustrated when, once again, Andre's blood test came back stating that he was not a match to the DNA left by their suspect. However, this time, police were not giving up. They felt deep down that Andre was their man, and they were not going to let him slip away again. So that's when they decided that since the DNA they had from their suspect had come from semen, they needed to obtain and compare a semen sample of Andre's against the suspect sample rather than a blood sample. And that, my friends, is when all of the pieces finally started to fall into place. Andre continued trying to deny any involvement in the crimes. That is until Dr. Buganovsky sat down with him. The two men actually sat and talked for 2 hours, a lot of which was spent reviewing the criminal profile that Dr. Buganovsky had come up with for the investigation. And upon hearing that someone finally understood him, regardless of the circumstances, well, this moved Andre to tears. That same night, Andre confessed to 36 of the 38 murders that police had linked to him, and over the following days, he confessed to, I think, upwards of like 20 more. He gave police a detailed description of each of the murders, in some cases even providing sketches of either crime scenes, victim positions, or landmarks that had been near the crime scene. Andre stood trial in Rostov in April of 1992. He was charged with 53 counts of murder, in addition to 5 charges of sexual assault against minors, which were the ones that he'd committed when he had been a teacher. And on October 14th, 1992, Andre was found guilty of 52 out of 53 counts of murder, and the following day, he was sentenced to death plus 86 years. He was given the opportunity to make a statement following his conviction and his sentence. However, he just chose to remain silent. Andre did try to appeal his conviction, and he tried to file for clemency through President Boris Yeltsin, but all of his efforts to evade his sentence were rejected, and on February 14th, Andre Chikatilo was led from his death row cell to a soundproof room within the prison, and he was executed with a single gunshot wound to the head, specifically behind his right ear. He was then buried in an unmarked grave within the prison cemetery, and he was put on a bus straight to hell, right where he belongs. And that, my friends, is the story of Andre Chikatilo, one of the most infamous serial killers in the world. Before his death, people were wildly fascinated by Andre, and many scientists and criminal researchers actually wanted to keep him alive in order to study him. And once he was dead, Japanese scientists actually offered to pay $1 million for Andre's brain. So yeah, people were just enthralled with this man. And I guess they still are, because here we are, having sat and talked about him for probably close to an hour at this point. Anyways, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Oh, also, if you're curious about anything that I used on my face, I have started linking that down in the description, so feel free to give it a look-see. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic that you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked in the description box. And if you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week, and if you turn on your post notifications, you'll be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. Absolutely fucking not. Lipstick on my teeth. No fucking clue what I'm about to do on my face. None whatsoever. Alright, I need all of this the fuck up out of my way. Is that gonna be too dark? Only one way to find out. My ass is asleep. Andrew. Who the fuck is Andrew? Oh boy, here we go, people. Here we fucking go. Is still wow. It was June 12th. What up, glitter? Oh, come on. What am I saying? All of the men that had been. All right, we're done here.